Chapter 1. The Man Behind the Smile. The carnival lights of 1970s Chicago glittered like false promises, but nowhere did they burn brighter than in the Graceland Cemetery on the night John Wayne Gacy became more than a man. He became a monster. By day, he was Pogo the Clown, bending balloon animals for children, drawing laughter with painted cheeks and rainbow wigs. Parents trusted him. Neighbors waved as he loaded tools into his Chevrolet. You'd never suspect the horrors concealed beneath that friendly grin. Beneath the grease paint's gaudy cheer lay a darkness that no one saw coming. Pogo's floppy shoes and jolly horn masked the hungry cruelty that festered in his basement. Behind the innocent laughter of birthday parties waited the echo of muffled screams. It was here, in the dank half-light of a suburban home that Park Ridge mothers and fathers believed safe, that Gacy lured his victims. Teenage boys he promised jobs, favors, or just a ride home. Close your eyes and imagine that grinning face leaning close, asking in a quiet voice whether you liked magic tricks. You sense nothing amiss until the trick begins. A rope loop behind your neck, a sudden pull, and the room spins as life drains away. And then the nightmare retreats back behind the mask. The carnival's bright lights, the clown's honk, and the laughter of children echoing down a silent street. By the time the echo fades, Gacy is gone. Back into daylight, back to barbecues with the PTA, back to the smiling volunteer who ran community fundraisers. Neighbors would later talk about how kind he was, how reliable, how completely normal. But in that basement, hidden behind a narrow closet door, lay the remains of 15 young men. Bones jumbled in the crawl space, their stories stifled until the day they could no longer be ignored. And when the authorities finally unmasked Pogo, they discovered a truth too ghastly to imagine. Tonight, we peel back the paint and step into the shadows of that suburban nightmare. We follow the twisted path from handshake to horror, from candy balloon to coffin, because before every monster is unmasked, he hides in plain sight, smiling at you from across the street. Welcome to the first chapter of John Wayne Gacy's story. Watch your step. The clown is coming. Late at night in suburban Norwood Park, the house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue sat silent beneath a blanket of dusk. But behind the basement door, a darker ritual played out, one that would chill Chicago to its core. The killing began quietly on a February evening in 1972, when 16-year-old Timothy McCoy accepted an offer of work at a local rummage sale. Trusting the community volunteer and Little League coach, he followed John Wayne Gacy into the basement workshop. Under the pretense of lifting heavy boxes, Tim bent forward and felt a sudden pressure at his neck as a nylon rope slipped into place. In less than 2 minutes, his struggling ceased. Gacy surveyed his work with clinical detachment, wiped the rope clean, then dragged the body into the crawl space, covering Tim's head with plastic sheeting and tucking the limp form among makeshift shelves. The corpse lay in near plain sight, invisible only because Gacy controlled who entered that domain. Nearly 2 years passed before the murders resumed, and during that lull, Gacy refined his methods. He constructed a hidden door under the basement stairs, laid fresh concrete in a small pit, and stocked the space with tools, rope loops, plastic tarps, and a simple homemade pulley system. Each detail reduced the chance of discovery and ensured efficiency. When he struck again in late 1974, The pattern was unmistakable. Lure with promises of work or beer, isolate the victim in the basement, strangle, and conceal. He recorded each killing in a ledger, dates, pseudonyms, sometimes ages, or brief descriptions, treating human lives as trophies on a sick checklist. In May 1975, 17-year-old John Butkovich arrived to help clean the garage. Gacy offered him a Pepsi, patted his shoulder, and led him down the basement stairs, donning his mask of calm before cinching the rope behind the boy's neck. A single, deliberate tug ended the struggle. Rigor mortis set in on the concrete pad as Gacy drained fluids, applied lime, and sealed the area with tar, later painting over the fresh cement to hide the shallow grave beneath. By 1976, Gacy's confidence had soared, and his killings became more frequent, sometimes weekly. He established a cruel routine, selecting runaways, hitchhikers, or boys with few ties, inviting them with flattery and friendliness, offering them beer or work, leading them into the basement, and standing behind his victim, looping the rope and applying a silent, methodical pull. He estimated that a skilled garroting took less than 2 minutes. Each assault left no cries for help, no frantic thrashing, just an eerie stillness. He later recalled feeling a sense of relief once the final breath was drawn. The summer of 1977 brought a chilling escalation. Between May and August alone, 6 more victims disappeared: Michael Marino, Darrell Sampson, John Sisk, and others. Their vanishings were whispered about at bus depots and YMCA floors, but investigators saw no pattern linking a respected community volunteer to the crimes. Gacy's alibis, church dinners, civic fundraisers, union meetings were airtight. In one incident, a hitchhiker named David Talsma accepted Gacy's ride. They spoke of baseball and Little League games. Gacy pulled into his driveway, pointed to the basement light, and asked if David wanted to see his workshop. David never emerged. By day, Gacy donned his Pogo the Clown outfit, white face paint, oversized shoes, balloon animals, and entertained at children's parties. Parents beamed. No one connected the laughing clown to the whisper of rope. This dual life fed his ego. A harmless entertainer by day, an executioner by night. In Pogo's painted smile, he found the perfect mask. Late 1977 into early 1978 marked the most gruesome chapters. Bodies had to be stacked head to toe as the crawl space overflowed. Gacy began spreading quicklime to mask odor and installed a cheap fan to exhaust foul air. He murdered 15-year-old Timothy O'Rourke, 17-year-old Kenneth Parker, and 17-year-old William Carroll, each time growing more brutal. In his diary, he noted Parker's stubborn struggle with ironic satisfaction when it took 3 pulls of the rope instead of 1. To cover his tracks, Gacy planted misleading clues: personal items in alleys, scraps of clothing near train tracks, hoping to implicate transients. Investigators pursued red herrings for months, unaware the real killer wore a homemade clown costume. Gacy even staged a mock police raid with a garden hose, splashing water on the lawn to mimic blood spatter, an audacious act that nearly succeeded. In late 1978, his hubris betrayed him. He offered help to 15-year-old Robert Piest, driving him to the home on Summerdale Avenue under the guise of job assistance. When Piest vanished, his mother refused to believe a clown could kill. But detectives noted Gacy's license plate, stopped his car, and found handcuffs, ropes, and Polaroid photos of bound young men. A search of 8213 West Summerdale revealed the stench of decay and 26 bodies in rows, some bleached by lime, others still fresh. Each victim was finally given a name, a story, a place in history. Chapter 3. He had perfected the routine by early 1976. The invitation, the descent into the basement, the strangulation, the concealment. His methods never varied wildly, but he refined each step with ruthless precision. He learned that sudden, unexpected force silenced resistance faster, so he wrapped the nylon rope high behind the victim's head, just beneath the hairline, then stepped forward, loop cinched, and tightened. In the cramped, dimly lit workshop basement, the victim's hands instinctively reached for the rope at the first touch. Their struggle only hastened the end. Gacy described it later as a 2-minute affair, sometimes less. His lure evolved over time. Early on, "I need help moving boxes" was enough to draw a trusting teenager. Later, he discovered that the promise of a beer or a show of police badges — he sometimes flashed arrest warrants he had forged — made the approach smoother. One victim reported that Gacy showed him a small portrait of his fire department badge, saying, "I've helped lots of boys like you get on their feet." When a young man named James Doc Stater responded to an ad for a summer painting job, he found himself alone in the house by mid-afternoon. The front door clicked shut behind him. Even after he knocked, no answer. When he finally heard the distant thud of footsteps, it was descending, a slow echo through the basement door. Inside, Gacy sometimes bound his victims first, handcuffing them to a support beam as he explained he'd just run downstairs to get a drink. He preferred the rope, however. It left little evidence when he carefully folded it away afterward. Once the victim was immobilized or unsuspecting beneath the garrote, Gacy, standing behind, would pull steadily. He later bragged that his strength let him finish the act in under a minute. Slower pulls meant more panic, more bubbles of air in the lungs, but he was methodical, drawing each breath out until life stilled. The bodies went limp immediately, sometimes their eyes remaining open, fixed in shock. The basement was both studio and execution chamber. Steel shelving held spare paint cans. A wooden workbench bore the scars of countless crudely cleaned knives. On one shelf lay a stack of Polaroid photographs, images of bound, nude youths whose faces were occasionally obscured by blindfolds or sideways hats. Gacy used these photos as part of a ritual, a warning to himself that the kill had occurred, that this body belonged somewhere beneath the floorboards. Concealment followed a grim pattern. He carried the body into the crawl space through a hidden hatch beneath the stairs. He fashioned a makeshift sliding board from a rubber bath mat and wooden plank, easing the corpse into position on the fresh concrete pad. A light dusting of quicklime covered the face and torso, enough to deter insects and soften odors, but not enough to destroy evidence of ligature marks or fibers. When space ran scarce, he stacked bodies head to toe, sometimes resting a third victim atop the first two, like stones in a grotesque cairn. Gacy kept meticulous notes. In a small ledger, scrawled entries read John 5-75 or Bozo Boy, September 77, age 16. These shorthand records were trophies, each name or pseudonym etched in ink. One entry, Lips Mac Clarky, included a note: struggle, 3 tugs. That referred to Kenneth Parker in January 1978. whose vigorous fight left bruises across his throat and shoulders. Gacy obliged by tightening 3 times before the body went still. Sexual assault was part of the crime for many victims. Gacy's later confession detailed how he forced young men into oral acts, sometimes photographing the act for his private collection. Though these details horrify, they underscored his complete domination, physical and psychological. The invasive acts left biological traces he seldom cleansed completely, and these traces would ultimately contribute to his undoing when forensic technology caught up. By late 1977, neighbors sometimes whispered about strange smells or strange comings and goings. Late cars parked in the driveway past midnight, fleeting shadows behind drawn curtains. Each time, Gacy donned his pogo costume and performed in bright primary colors, audaciously reassuring the community that any rumors were nonsense. At the local VFW hall, he led kids in song with a booming ta-da and deadpan jokes about disappearing teenagers. "Don't worry, friends, I only make balloon animals vanish." He grew careless as his confidence soared. On one cold December night in 1977, Gacy invited 2 boys, brothers returning from a party, to warm themselves by his basement heater. He offered them hot cocoa, the scent of marshmallows drifting up the stairs. They accepted and followed him down. When one brother balked at the sight of tools hanging on the wall, Gacy reassured him, "Don't mind the power saw. I've got more important work tonight." Minutes later, both lay silent in the crawl space. Gacy recounted later how one brother's limp body twisted unnaturally, and he had to adjust, remarking, "They're like dolls. Once they go stiff, they're easier to stack." Over time, Gacy's disposal methods grew riskier. He once burned clothing in a backyard fire pit, tossing smaller items, belts, caps, wallet scraps, into the embers. Ash and bone fragments were scattered in the grass, later washed away by rain. On another occasion, he rented a storage locker under a false name, stashing plastic tubs of dismembered remains. But logistics proved cumbersome, and the risk of unearthing human fragments was too real. He returned to the crawl space, his grim gallery, and poured a fresh layer of cement, smoothing it with a trowel as if patching a small patio. Each murder left its fingerprint on Gacy's psyche. He recorded his moods in a journal. Felt unstoppable tonight. After a January kill, guiltless remake after another, psychologists later noted that Gacy experienced a mixture of relief and euphoria, symptoms of a predator empowered by secrecy. The final months before his arrest saw him kill with increasing frequency, sometimes 3 times in a week, testing how close he could push detection. He began luring victims not from bars or work sites, but directly from the street, approaching young men alone at bus stops, mimicking the helpfulness he once craved for himself as a boy. On December 11th, 1978, Robert Pease, a 15-year-old, entered Gacy's green Oldsmobile, remarking how warm it was inside. Gacy smiled, adjusting the rearview mirror. As the car rattled down Archer Avenue, Piest chatted about school. Gacy nodded, then said, "I know a good place to talk." That place was the Summerdale house. Detective Joseph Kozenjak, acting on a tip about the car's license plate, stopped Gacy minutes later. In the back seat, they found a pair of handcuffs, a length of nylon rope, and the leather strap of a dress belt. Tools of the trade, as ordinary as a plier set. They arrested him on the spot. The unmasking of Pogo laid bare the full horror of his methods. Forensic teams peeled back layers of concrete, uncovering 26 young men whose lives ended at his hands. In each case, the rope loops, the plastic sheeting, the painted-over patches in the basement floor spoke of a killer who saw murder as craft, efficient, concealed, routine. When the narrative concluded, the story of Chicago's most notorious serial killer was no longer whispered in alleys, but etched in court transcripts and medical reports. A chain of violence documented by the very tools Gacy once used to commit his crimes. The morning after Gacy's arrest felt eerily calm in suburban Norwood Park, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Detectives had drained the basement floodlight, revealing only a gaping hatch and the faint odor of mildew. For the first time in 6 years, the crawl space beneath those stairs was exposed, and with it, a secret world of terror. Investigators crouched among the broken plywood and shattered concrete, cataloging rope fragments, plastic sheeting, and fragments of stained clothing. Each piece told a fragment of a story, a silent witness to the violence that had gone undisturbed for so long. Forensic teams sketched the room in exacting detail, the location of every body, the angle of each striation on the support beam where victims had been bound, the subtle discolorations in the poured cement that marked earlier excavations. Word spread quickly through Chicago's corridors of power. The smiling clown who charmed neighborhood kids was the architect of carnage. As news crews swarmed the leafy street, Gacy sat in a steel chair under harsh fluorescent lights, dutifully answering questions in a clipped monotone. He confessed to 12 murders at first, then 20, until at last he admitted 25. Each confession was cataloged by a stenographer, whose pen scratched across legal pads while officers stood guard outside the window. When he spoke of the rope, his voice carried an unsettling pride. "I knew exactly how much force to use," he said. "I could feel them go limp in my arms." Autopsies followed with grim precision. Pathologists noted the ligature marks around necks, the tiny abrasions where rope raveled against tender skin, and the faint residue of quicklime on bone fragments. Biological stains, semen, saliva, sweat, yielded DNA that linked Gacy to several victims beyond his own ledger. Detectives compared fibers from his overalls to threads caught in clothing recovered from crawlspace gaps. Paint chips flaked from the aging floorboards matched the layers Gacy had used to hide fresh concrete. Each microscopic match tightened the noose of evidence. Courtroom preparations began in earnest as the state assembled its case. Prosecutors laid out the timeline, how a stolen business card led to the first missing boy, how an anonymous tip from a neighbor sparked the traffic stop that capped the spree. Family members of the victim sat behind the prosecution table, clutching photographs and scrapbooks. They stared down at Gacy when he entered the room, his appearance immaculate, suit pressed, white hair combed into place. Defense attorneys argued that Gacy had been mentally unstable, that the years of abuse at his father's hands had shattered his psyche and left him unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. Psychiatric experts testified on both sides, debating whether Gacy's actions stemmed from an irresistible compulsion or a cold, calculating will. The trial stretched over 3 harrowing months. Witness after witness took the stand. The young man who had escaped the basement by feigning unconsciousness, the dentist who had identified Gacy's bite marks on a bruised shoulder, the crime lab technician who meticulously matched paint samples. Through it all, Gacy maintained a hollow calm. Occasionally, he glanced at the jury, a faint smile playing on his lips. He told one reporter, off the record, that he saw himself as a defender of order, culling those he deemed unworthy. His words filled the courtroom with a disquieting chill. On the final day, the jury retired for deliberation. Hours turned into days as they pored over evidence sheets, reviewed photographs, and watched video recordings of Gacy's confessions. Outside, protesters and supporters clashed on the courthouse steps. Some demanded mercy, others screamed for justice. When the four-person emerged, the weight of the moment pressed upon the gathered crowd. One by one, the jurors stood to announce their verdict. Guilty on 33 counts of aggravated sexual assault and murder. When the verdict was read, a hush fell, broken only by the soft sobs of mothers and sisters who had spent years waiting for this moment. Sentencing followed swiftly. The judge, voice heavy with solemnity, imposed the maximum penalty under Illinois law, death by lethal injection. Gacy's face remained inscrutable. He did not plead for clemency, nor did he show fear. Instead, he said, "I suppose this is my final act of service to the community." His words, delivered without remorse, echoed in the stunned silence that followed. In the years before his execution, Gacy became the subject of endless study. True crime authors pored over court transcripts, searching for clues to his pathology. Psychologists published papers on his transformation from abused child to self-styled clown to serial killer. Journalists traced the ripple effects of his crimes on investigative procedures. Basement searches became standard in missing person cases. Fiber analysis units were expanded. Police departments instituted special training on recognizing high-functioning offenders. On May 10, 1994, nearly 16 years after his first murder, John Wayne Gacy walked into Stateville Correctional Center and lay down on the gurney. He gazed up at the ceiling for a moment, then turned his head to the warden and said, "Kiss my ass." The lethal drugs followed, and after 20 minutes, his heart stopped. 24 families found a measure of closure, yet the legacy of his crimes persisted in nightmares, in documentaries, in the cautionary tales told to every neighborhood watch. For beneath every smiling mask lies a moment of choice, and Gacy's choice warned a generation. Evil can masquerade as kindness, and the most ordinary exterior may hide the darkest of souls. In the hush that followed John Wayne Gacy's sentencing, the echo of his crimes lingered like a specter over Chicago's suburbs. The case had unfolded with grim precision, the basement unearthed, the bodies counted, the ledger exposed. Yet the true reckoning was not only in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those left behind. In this final chapter, we follow the aftermath of horror, how a community healed, how justice was served, and how the shadow of Pogo the Clown endures as a cautionary tale for generations. When Gacy was taken from the courthouse to Stateville Correctional Center, families of the victims stood together in silent solidarity. Mothers held photographs of boys who would never return. Fathers clutched stale newspaper clippings of missing posters. They had waited years for this moment, and as the gates of the prison slammed shut, a collective release began. A release of tears, of grief, of pent-up anger, finally given a target. Some traveled to the burial sites to lay wreaths of white lilies and fresh labor roses. Others started foundations to support troubled youth, determined that no other boy would fall through the cracks of society as theirs had. Meanwhile, in the sterile chambers of Illinois politics, legislators drafted new laws. Mandatory checks on home basements and missing person investigations became standard procedure. Outreach programs reached out to runaways, offering shelter and hotlines. Small measures born of Gacy's depravity, but designed to catch those who otherwise slipped into the killer's crosshairs. Law enforcement agencies across the country established specialized cold case units inspired by the forensic breakthroughs that cracked Gacy's case, from fiber analysis to early DNA work. Generations of detectives would study his file as a blueprint for both criminal cunning and procedural vigilance. Inside the prison walls, Gacy was both reviled and studied. Journalists clamored for interviews, psychologists sought his insights into the mind of a serial killer. He answered some questions, deflected others, always with that languid charm that once endeared him to neighbors. He painted himself as a misunderstood soul. In his accounts, the rope was a tool, the basement a workshop, the ledger a record-keeping habit. Some listeners were repelled, others were morbidly fascinated. But no apology ever came, no spark of true remorse. His final words, delivered with sardonic defiance on the night before his execution, echoed his lifelong mask. "Kiss my ass." On the day the lethal drugs flowed through his veins, the world outside Stateville barely stirred. News crews replayed old footage of Gacy in a clown suit, offering balloons to laughing children, a villain in colorful garb. True crime podcasts dissected every detail. Historians archived his biography, and amateur sleuths debated whether any victims were unaccounted for. But for most, the narrative reached its inexorable close. Justice achieved at the cost of 26 young lives. Yet the deeper story lives on in the lessons learned. In Chicago's North Side, a new youth center erects a mural of hope. Boys playing under open skies, free of fear. In classrooms, students study the Gacy case as part of criminal justice curricula, honing skills in victimology and forensic science. Neighborhood watches carry laminated flyers on stranger danger protocols, offering a small defense against predators who blend in too well. For the families, healing was not linear. Anniversaries of disappearances became days of remembrance and resilience. Some forged friendships with other survivors' kin, turning shared tragedy into collective purpose. They spoke at gatherings, lobbied for stronger privacy laws to protect minors, and funded scholarship programs in their sons' names. From the basement's darkest recess emerged a network of compassion, an unintended legacy of light. In the annals of true crime, John Wayne Gacy's name remains a stark warning that evil often wears a human face, that the most ordinary exterior may conceal the most unspeakable interior. But amid the horror, his story also underscores the durability of justice and the capacity of communities to rise, rebuild, and remember. Every time a detective reopens a cold file with renewed resolve, every time a runaway hotline saves a frightened boy from the streets, Gacy's legacy is reclaimed by vigilance and by care.